So I was talking with my jiu-jitsu coach the other day, and he basically said so many guard players and so many just jiu-jitsu guys in general, they just suffer with back pain, probably more than anything. And yes, like shoulders, knees, definitely very popular places to injure as well. But what I would say is that back pain is probably the most common thing that you see with jiu-jitsu athletes, and a lot of times they're putting a lot of strain on their back unnecessarily, and a lot of it is a result of a lack of hip mobility, particularly in the direction of internal rotation. So internal rotation is when I rotate my femur inwards and my foot goes out. What jiu-jitsu athletes typically have a lot of is external rotation, right? So think about a guy playing like rubber guard. Think about shooting something like a triangle. That's all very like external rotation based movement. And where people are typically lacking is that IR. Now you do want to have a good amount of total motion, meaning that you have a lot of ER, but you want some IR as well. And having that IR will then give you that mobility to then take stress off of your lower back. And a lot of times if you don't have that IR, sometimes you can see like pinching in the front of the hips, and you can also see more strain on the lower back because the back has to do more work that the hips can't do. And if you can create some of that mobility, it can create a little bit of slack and almost take some of the brunt instead of the back just doing all the work, and then people's backs will get really tight, or they might do something like herniated disc, something like that. So with that being said, I would say one of the best stretches that I like to do to kind of open up the back of the hip is a posterior capsule stretch, or a modified pigeon is typically what I like to call it. So I want to show you first kind of what's going on here. So if you look at just a normal pelvis, a lot of times for people that are very external rotation based, so think about people with like a lot of a lot of ER, typically what you're going to see is their pelvis is going to be more oriented like this, where the back is very closed off, and it's going to be very biased towards external rotation. So this part of my pelvis, the back part, this is called the posterior pelvic outlets, left and right. And so when I have this position, I'm going to be more biased towards ER. And you see this a lot, especially with people with more of a narrow rib cage, especially. So a lot of like my long, lean athletes will typically present this way, especially. And when you have all that ER and you have that posterior pelvic outlet that is relatively compressed and closed, this position will actually help to open that. So what we want to create is basically the opposite, where we can open up the back of the hip and allow for some of that internal rotation this way. That will help to take stress off of the back. And as you can see, it obviously is all connected, because the more I can move what's called my ilium bone and my femur, the less I'll have to move through stuff like my sacrum and then my lower back. So with that being said, one move that I really, really like is the pigeon stretch. And what I typically do is I elevate my knee. I take something like a yoga block, and say it's your left hip or your left low back that's particularly irritated. Maybe you have pinching in the front of your left hip. What I typically do is I take the block, I put it down, I put whatever hip I want to stretch, I elevate it on the block. So I'll take my left knee and I'll put it down on the pad. From there, I'm going to take my right knee, I'm going to take it up, and I'm going to take it over. Now notice this leg staying completely vertical. I'm not going into external rotation. A lot of times guys will sit in this external rotation, or they'll do like this stretch in the gym. And a lot of times this is already external rotation. So you're stretching into a position that you're already really good at. And we don't really want that. That's actually still gonna close off the back of your hip, and it will stretch some muscle and you will feel it there, but you're not facilitating the position that you want to from a posterior pelvic outlet position. So elevate your knee, keep your leg relatively vertical here. You're gonna take your other leg up and over, and you're gonna end up with this position where your knee is actually on the other side of your shoe, dropping all the way down to the ground. From here, if I put weight through my front leg, I'm gonna start to feel a stretch to the back of my hip, and then I want you to take your opposite elbow and see if you can bring it all the way down to the ground so that my torso is basically rotating towards my front leg here. From here, I'm just gonna breathe in through my nose and out through my mouth for about 5 breaths or about 60 seconds. That will help to open up the back of my hip, and I really only wanna feel that through the back of my hip. If I have pinching in the front, that's not so good. I actually don't want that, and if I ever see that in the clinic, typically I'll regress to another activity. I'll create some space in the back of their hip and less hip flexion, and then we'll come back to this position over time and see if they still get that hip pinching. So if it's bothering you in the front of the hip doing this, I would say don't do it. But if you can get into this position and you feel the back of your hip really opening up, this one is huge for not only helping you rotate better and moving through your hips better, but it will take stress off your low back, and it will really help with just overall mobility in general, but also really help you with your jiu-jitsu.